Okay, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. We're still expecting some folks to roll in, but I'm so glad that we're all on the call. Welcome, my name is Giovanna Townsend. I work for Groundswell Center for Local Food and Farming. Welcome to Farming for Justice. I use she, her pronouns. Farming for Justice is a monthly discussion group for farmers and food systems workers. A little bit more about Groundswell. Groundswell focuses on equity in the food systems, regenerative agriculture, and farmer training in the Finger Lakes region of New York State. We want to take a quick moment to welcome anyone who wants to share their story or their work on this platform. Feel free to reach out to Groundswell, me specifically. I'll put a link in the chat below. We welcome anyone who wants to share their story around food, farming, activism, land, and this platform does prioritize BIPOC and LGBTQ+ voices. So if you or someone you know might be interested, feel free to pass their info along or reach out. We also want to take a moment to announce our new farmer training program. Groundswell's new farmer training program is an opportunity for BIPOC farmers to join us in Ithaca for a 6-month part-time compensated program. This is for 2021, spring 2021. Again, I'm going to link more information to this in the chat below, but I hope you check it out and spread the word. It's going to be a really wonderful program and has been very extensively developed with a multicultural group of community members from Ithaca and the local food system. So I'm really excited that it's finally launching. And I also want to talk about some upcoming Farming for Justice events we're going to be having. In December, we're going to welcome the Coalition of Immokalee Workers in partnership with the Alliance for Fair Food to talk about fair food in the time of COVID. The Coalition of Immokalee Workers focuses on farm worker rights, trafficking, human trafficking, justice, and safety, and does a lot of activism and policy work. So they're going to be talking about the importance of farm worker rights, especially during COVID. And then in January, we're going to be joined by an Indigenous-led nonprofit, the Sikangu Food Sovereignty Initiative. They are based in Lakota land in the Midwest, and they're going to be sharing with us their wonderful work about the 7th Gen Food System Plan. And basically they have an over 100-year plan, a multi-generational plan to heal Lakota land and Lakota people. And create lasting change on a small community level. So it's going to be a really wonderful, beautiful event that I hope that you can all join us for. We will link that as well. And Farming for Justice is a free event. We compensate our presenters and offer this free to the public. But something that helps keep this going and keep this free and keep this equitable is hearing your feedback. And we also love, hearing what you're thinking, what you want to hear, anything you want to share with us. It's an opportunity to give a shout out to presenters. So I will link the evaluation link during the event as well. And I will also email it to you, and I'll email all of these links later as well. And before we get started, I just want to make a space for a land acknowledgement. Like I said before, Groundswell Center for Local Food and Farming is based in Ithaca, New York, in the Finger Lakes region on unceded Guyancono territory, or Cayuga land. We think it's really important to acknowledge the land theft and genocide that happened here, and how all non-Indigenous people benefit from it in some ways today. And that the land theft and genocide still takes place and happens to Indigenous people in our communities today, but also that Indigenous people are not gone and they're very much alive and present. And I just want to create this space as a token of respect and accountability on our end to recognize these injustices today and how it all plays out. If you're not familiar with who's present in your community and your region, we always recommend this great resource, native-land.ca. I will link this in the chat below also, and also in our follow-up email with all the other links. So I highly recommend checking this out just to know who has been and who currently is present where you are. And now finally, I'm really, really excited to welcome Christy Cabrera Robledo. We have had lots of signups for this event, and I feel like there's not enough resources on this topic. So we're so glad that Christy is joining us today to share her work and her insight and expertise about race and disability and justice on land. I don't want to talk too much about Christy because I know that Christy is going to talk a little bit about herself, but I do want to just take a moment to, thank you, Christy, so much for joining us. Thank you to everyone on the call who's tuning in and part of this work. And Christy, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Yes, thank you. So we could go to the intro slide. Yeah, great. So thank you everyone for taking the time to be here with me. This is a topic that I am really passionate about and hope that what is shared here will encourage more conversations around disability and racial injustices on the land. To start off, I want to say that I'm not an expert in disability or racial injustices. The information I present to you today comes from personal, academic, and professional backgrounds that I have. So we could go to the next slide. Thank you. So personally, I'm coming to you as a person of color who also has mental health and sensory processing challenges. However, I acknowledge that I am a light-skinned person of color and that these challenges are invisible. So therefore, I have privileges that others do not. And my knowledge and perspectives are often limited. So I want to hold space for others to share their diverse stories regarding this topic. So please use the chat feature to explain, to discuss, to share your stories on any of the information that I present here today. And hopefully we have time at the end to talk a little bit more. So I am an occupational therapist. What that means is that I'm a healthcare professional. So my job is to help people who engage in certain activities or occupations, but they have difficulty doing so because they may not have the skills or the activity or environment itself isn't the perfect match for them. So I use my clinical knowledge to help people gain skills, but I also modify activities and the environment so that there is more success between the interaction of that. We could go to the next slide. So the slide number 3. Yeah, great, thank you. So there is a lot to unpack regarding racial and disability injustices on the land. But these 3 concerns are the reason why I started studying this topic and what guided me when creating this presentation. So the first thing I want to acknowledge is that there are so many amazing things happening right now where Black, Indigenous, and POC folk are reclaiming and reconnecting to the land, right? People are doing things from raising money to purchase land. They are providing educational programs on everything from herbal medicine to gardening to decolonizing health. However, what I'm not seeing is a lot of discussion or effort being made to make sure that this movement involves disabled people. The second thing is, due to ableism and racism, BIPOC and disabled folks are treated poorly on the land, where further physical, emotional, spiritual, or cognitive challenges can occur due to this treatment. And the last thing is that financial barriers prevent and limit BIPOC and disabled folks from engaging in nature, as well as trying to make nature spaces more accessible and inclusive. You go to the next slide. Thank you. So today, I hope that you will be able to identify at least 3 reasons why it's difficult for disabled and BIPOC folk to connect with the land, understand why nature is important to BIPOC and disabled individuals, and describe the work that needs to be done internally, but also externally. Next. So I want to acknowledge a project that I started, which helped me guide this presentation. So I started this project called Growing Food in This Body. And this project is about interviewing disabled people who feel deeply connected to nature and just capturing their lived experiences and stories. I think there's not enough information about this topic, and this is my attempt to kind of try to close that gap. And with the stories they share and the photos they share, I'm hoping that this helps me understand more the injustices that are occurring. It provides information as to what accessibility and inclusivity could look like in nature, as well as media representation, which really isn't happening right now. Next slide. So I'm a firm believer that if you want to dismantle a system, if you want to create justice, if you want to stop oppression, all those amazing things, you have to look within first and reflect on how society has influenced your mind and your life. So I want everyone to just take a moment to reflect on these questions. The first is, what words do you use to describe your physical, mental, and emotional health? What is your relationship to illness, aging, and dying? How do your identities impact your views on disability and illness? And how do you think your body will support your engagement on the land in 10, 20, and 30 years from now? And if any of these questions resonate with you, please feel free to share your answers in the chat section. We could go to the next slide. So I want to clarify that I will be using the phrase nature spaces throughout the presentation. And a nature space can be a park, a farm, a garden, a nature space you create in your home. And I'm using this phrase because not every person has the same access to nature spaces. So for one person, a tree-lined block is their nature space, while for others, their large backyard is their nature space. And all these spaces can be critically analyzed in order to see if there's any injustices there. Next slide. All right, so I don't need to say this, but I will anyways. Nature supports the disabled and BIPOC communities. There is lots of research on how it supports people in general, not so much research on how it supports these specific communities, but I'm gonna share a few things that I discovered. So we know that access to the natural environment has a positive impact on cognitive development as well as stress management for children. We know that nature experiences benefit children with attention deficit disorder. And on the other hand, we just know from our own experiences and listening to others that many BIPOC have a relationship to the land that deeply impacts their identity and way of life. And that plant and food medicine used within the disabled and the BIPOC community is profound. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so I wanted to share a story or some quotes from one of the participants from my project, Growing Food in This Body. And this is Jamie, the guy on the right, who shared these quotes with me. He said, "Deadheading taught me a lot about letting go. Cut off a flower in order to grow flowers. I thought about the things I'm holding on to just because they were once alive, that are taking up space and choking off opportunities for new growth. I breathed out as I watched the sunflowers midway through unfurling the petals I had made room to nurture. And I let go of my recently diagnosed hip dysplasia being cured. I deadhead the unnecessary thought that is keeping me in stasis, dreaming of a return to a thing which is now dead. And in its wake, I leave space to move forward, to strategize ways to be mobile that work with my body. I give myself permission to stop holding myself on pause in the hope that physio will cure this. I plan for fundraising for an electric power chair, which will give me back the mobility I was hoping physio would create in my legs. in my dream power share, I can allow myself to grow anew. And I use these quotes quite often because as an occupational therapist, a healthcare professional, my career is about helping others, as many of my clients experience major life changes like having to use a mobility device or starting medication. But there's nothing that I could ever say as a healthcare professional to someone that would provide hope and acceptance the way that nature could. I believe that nature is the greatest teacher and healer. And when we don't have spaces that are welcoming to BIPOC and disabled people, we are denying them their right to learn and heal from the land. Let's go to the next slide. That being said, if we did a quick Google search or we went into nature spaces, we find two things. One, a lot of the individuals in these spaces are white. And two, a lot of these individuals either don't have disabilities or they're not visible disabilities. And that's the reason why we're all here today, is to try to unpack why this is going on. So whether it's the park ranger, urban farmer, the herbalist in your communities, a lot of times they tend to look and appear a certain way. Next slide. And because of this situation, we have assumptions, right? We assume that whiteness and non-disabled bodies are the norm in nature spaces, but that these people are also the experts, right? In agriculture, plant knowledge, herbal medicine, activities like hiking, and these assumptions are extremely harmful. Let's go to the next. So before we begin, kind of trying to unpack, which is very difficult to do in 90 minutes, I think we have to first start at the root, which is understanding terms and models. Some of you may be familiar with all these things, but just so that we're all on the same page. So disabilities can be visible, meaning that they're immediately apparent, so someone using a wheelchair, or they could be non-invisible, so you don't immediately realize that a person has a disability, like someone who is autistic. Ableism is the discrimination against people with disabilities, and there's internalized and systemic ableism. Internalized ableism is when disabled people themselves internalize society's discriminatory messages, while systemic ableism is everything in our world, our barriers, policies, and laws that exclude disabled people, but also the lack of urgency that everyone has to making anything better. There's also the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is a civil rights law that prohibits discrimination based on disability. But what we will learn is that just because there is this law doesn't mean that it still doesn't happen and that there's loopholes. Next. So non-disabled privilege is when you have physical, cognitive, and emotional capabilities that allow you to engage in the world with ease. You might be familiar with the term abled body privilege, and I'm trying not to use that term anymore because there's a lot of criticism that everybody is able, so I'm trying to start using non-disabled in my day-to-day life. Then there's neurotypical, which describes when people have typical development and that they are considered normal. And then neurodiverse is a word to help us understand that everyone has human variation and that we're all different from each other. Next slide. Okay, so again, getting to the root of understanding ableism means that we have to look at the medical industrial complex, so which we could also call the healthcare system. And on each corner are some really great things that the healthcare system focuses on, right? Science and medicine, access, safety, and health. And in these corners, we have some amazing healthcare professionals who actually help people in the healthcare system. But what we see when we go through history and we listen to people and we experience things on our own, the medical industrial complex is rooted in oppression and violence. So we can trace back to see how it's rooted in eugenics, desirability, charity and ableism, and population control. And a system that isn't rooted in other people's oppressions, violence, trauma, all the key words in gray at the top, is never going to truly heal people. And when we look at this industry, we can see how the root of it causes a lot of stigma and stereotypes within the disabled community. Let's go to the next slide. So let's start at the basics. Let's define disability. This disability definition comes from the CDC, and it says that a disability is any condition of the body or mind that makes it more difficult for a person to engage in activities or the world around them. Right away, we could criticize this definition because there's no spiritual recognition, and those who feel deeply connected to the land know that, acknowledging your spirit is very important, but also that this definition places the condition and the burden on the person itself. Let's go to the next slide. And then we could also look at the model of disability. There's different models out there, but the medical model is the most dominant one. And this medical model says that disease is detected and identified through a systematic process of observation, description, differentiation in accordance with standard accepted procedures. Right away, we see that this model suggests that a disease should follow a similar presentation in each person. Therefore, treatment should be the same, and assumes that the disease must be understood by the observer, right? That should be a red flag. And this makes me wonder, who is the observer, what is their background, and who creates these standard and accepted procedures that says, hey, based on this, you have a disability. Next page. So let's try to unpack race and terms relating to it. I would hope that everyone here has an understanding of all these words, but just let's spend some time going over them. Racism is racial prejudice and power coming together. There's individual racism, so that's someone who has racist assumptions and beliefs. And then there's systemic racism, so the policies and practices that are embedded within institutions. White privilege and white supremacy is different. Privilege on one hand means that there is unquestioned or unearned advantages because you're white, while white supremacy is the idea that white people's ideas, thoughts, beliefs, etc. are superior than people of color and their ideas, etc. Next page. There are two events that I will be talking about today that I wanted to make sure everyone had an understanding of what they were. So Jim Crow laws were laws that allowed racial segregation in public facilities. And redlining is a discriminatory practice that denies an applicant or a community institutional financial resources. So this could be like a loan to buy a house due to their race or ethnicity. And throughout our history, we know that the homeowners loan cooperation would look at maps and they would determine if a certain neighborhood was worthy of the loans that they could provide and the resources they had. And they would mark off communities that were populated by Black and brown bodies in red. And these were the communities that they were not going to financially support, right? So other colors like blue and yellow, sorry, I got distracted by the comments. And yes, I will describe alternative views on disability towards the end. So other colors like blue and yellow are neighborhoods that were sort of in the middle where they may have been POC folks, but it wasn't too bad. And then the green communities were communities filled with white people that they felt was safe enough to invest in, and therefore those communities were developed more than other communities. Let's go to the next slide. So I believe that ableism and racism together influences the physical design of spaces, right? And when we have physical design that is rooted in ableism and racism, we have circumstances that are terrible for these communities. On one hand, disabled people, due to physical design, have inaccessible housing, inaccessible nature spaces, as well as inaccessible gardening and farming tools. On the other hand, there's things like segregation, redlining, forced relocation, and inaccessible housing when it comes to money. This in This therefore causes nature deprivation, right, based on my research. When these communities are experiencing nature deprivation, it creates this assumption. So people think, well, here's a park or here's a community garden, and there aren't disabled people here, or there aren't BIPOC people here, so therefore these people don't want to be here, right? That assumption then creates a cycle of non-inclusive spaces. And I really love this quote from Ibada Wadoud. She is a social entrepreneur as well as a professor. And I sat in one of her design webinars, and she said, when we benefit from oppression, we're more likely to design for oppression. Let's go to the next. So let's kind of unpack how nature, how nature deprivation impacts BIPOC communities. So a lot of people think that segregation only happened in public schools, bathrooms, restrooms, they happened on buses, but it also happens in nature spaces, including our national parks. So these quotes come from this collection of stories called Untold Stories from America's National Parks. And the first quote is from Sister Dominica, who describes what happened to her. She was a Black woman, describes what happened to her when she went to a national park with a group of friends. She says, I was amazed when we reached the gates yesterday and were told by the superintendent that it was a law that colored people should be segregated from the whites on the picnic grounds. If we had gone much further, we should have been in the water. There was no table or benches, such as you would expect to find in a picnic ground or any other conveniences. The superintendent returned later and brought 2 old and dirty buckets of water for us to drink from. So she files a complaint. She expresses her concerns to the administration of this national park. And it was documented one of the person's responses to her complaint. So Philip is one of the white administrators, and he says, I would say offhand that not more than 1% of our visitors are colored, and it does not seem justifiable to maintain a special picnic ground for them. And if we did, we would soon be swamped with colored people. That kind of news travels fast. And right away, we see that one, there's this assumption that these people don't want to be in this nature space. There's no need to modify in any way for them. And if we did modify it for them, it would attract them. And this was maybe 80 something years ago. So maybe your grandparents lived during this time that this was recorded. And we see how the older generation still has these concerns about being in certain spaces. Let's go to the next slide. There was also segregation that happened between bodies of water, so beaches and lakes. And I want to particularly talk about an event that happened during the 1919 Chicago race riot. So there was a young Black teenage boy who was swimming in Lake Michigan, and he crossed, apparently, this invisible border between what was considered to be the Black side and the white side. So he crossed on over to this white side, and a white man who felt that he crossed over this invisible line started to throw rocks and stones at him, which ultimately led to his death. And an event like that sparked more riots that happened within that year. And this is a quote from someone who grew up in that time. And he said, I was never permitted to learn to swim. For 6 years, we lived within 2 blocks of the lake, but that did not change my parents' attitudes. To Dad and Mama, the blue lake always had a tinge of red from the blood of that young Black boy. And there's a lot of information out there about segregation that happens to do with pools and beaches and water, because there was this ongoing joke, right, that Black people don't swim. What people don't realize is that there's this historical perspective as to how trying to learn how to swim, spending time in water could have these violent consequences. There's not as much information about how redlining has impacted people's ability to engage in nature. But what we do know is that communities that were considered to be in the red areas now have an average of 23% tree canopy, over communities that were white, were in the green areas, have a percent of 43% of tree canopy. And we can look at that from a perspective of trees make things prettier, but also when we have trees in our neighborhoods, it decreases the level of heat that is in that neighborhood. So a lot of communities who don't have a lot of tree-lined blocks or areas experience higher heat levels than other people. And if your neighborhood is extremely hot and uncomfortable, you're less likely to go outside and spend time in the summer or whatever season you're in. Let's go to the next slide. Okay. So there's not as much research on how nature deprivation impacts disabled communities, which is a problem in itself. But we can make some assumptions. We could assume that when 3.6 million Americans are housebound, so they don't leave their house because of their disability, they're not engaging in nature. Even though the ADA requires businesses to make spaces accessible, there's a loophole. They say make your space accessible when it's readily achievable, AKA without much difficulty or expense. So as you can imagine, if a business feels it's difficult or it's expensive, they're not going to do it. There is a lack of accessible toilets, seating outdoors, and transportation that prevents disabled communities from engaging in nature due to this poor design. And I think it's like 6% of federal funds go into supporting transportation in rural communities. So Joseph is the man in this photo. He is someone that I interviewed. He is a macro photographer. So he takes super up close photos of small wildlife. So different bugs and insects. And he also uses a wheelchair. So it's important for him to go to nature spaces that are accessible in order to take these photos. But we had a really interesting conversation how sometimes when people make a space accessible, they take out the wildlife in that space, right? He says the more often you're going to manicure the park, the less you're going to find biodiversity there. So he talks about the specific park that he doesn't go to because it's really just super manicured grass and a path with a few trees. And they say, hey, this is accessible nature park. Everyone gets to enjoy. But for someone like Joseph and for many of us who really go to nature to experience the biodiversity, some accessible spaces don't encourage that. And that's exciting to me because now we could think about how can we create accessible spaces that maximize the biodiversity there. Let's go to the next slide. Another thing to point out is that nature deprivation happens because having an outdoor space is extremely expensive. Outdoor spaces is considered an amenity, so it's like a luxury. And I mean, even now with the pandemic, we see how important it is to have an outdoor space. In New York City, where I'm located, rentals with outdoor spaces have been looked for 270% more than before the pandemic started. And an outdoor space is calculated based on the square foot, but also they will put a certain price tag based on the usability and layout of a space. They will put a price tag based on how much sun the space gets, based on the noise level around the space. And that's really upsetting because if you use, let's say, a mobility device, you need a space to be a certain size and layout for you to actually be able to engage in that space. So the fact that automatically you would pay a higher price because of that is an injustice in itself. Let's go to the next slide. So the next thing is now we have the idea that classism and racism come together to influence the power dynamics at someone's work. So that's people who work on a farm, who volunteer, who apprentice in farms, gardens, any other nature space. And when there's these power dynamics, it can cause a disregard to basic human needs as well as unrealistic or problematic expectations. And that causes a risk for physical, emotional, cognitive, and spiritual challenges or disabilities. Let's go to the next. Okay, so here are some screenshots of different job descriptions regarding farm or gardening labor. And what's underlined is the expectation that the farm owner or whoever the person hiring has. We see that they are expecting people to work longer hours during harvesting, that they can lift 55 pounds, work up to 12 hours a day, in all weather conditions, withstand the demands, must be in good shape, considerable visual and physical effort, but we're going to pay you $13.50 an hour for 60 hours a week, or we're going to pay you $11 to $13 an hour based on your experience. So even though an activity like farming can be labor intensive, it doesn't have to be. And there are ways to do accommodations, but we don't see that here. And we also see that people are getting paid less than what they deserve. Let's go to the next slide. So these unrealistic expectations, what happens is that disabled people do not apply to these jobs, right? Or they apply, but they don't disclose their disability. And then these unrealistic expectations, I believe, causes a disconnect to the land. So if you are someone who feels deeply connected to the land and you want to be a steward of the land, and you work in a place where they use pesticide use because they want to maximize their profits, that's a disconnect, right? We know that pesticides, certain pesticides, are harmful to nature. If they make you do weeding because the expectation is remove these plants to allow other plants to grow, that's also a disconnect. And a whole nother conversation about how a lot of the weeds that we weed are actually medicinal and they serve a purpose in our ecosystem. Same with overplanting and harvesting. And then we find in the literature that certain injuries are due to overuse. So heat stroke, strains, arthritis. We see from oral stories from immigrant workers, there's limited breaks, and even nutrition is an issue. I've heard so many times that farmers do not eat what they grow, that everything they grow is for profit because they're trying to make a certain amount of income. So I've come across so many stories of migrants who died on the land because of heat stroke or who suffered an injury. And when they explained what they ate for lunch, it was something like crackers and soda, which doesn't make sense when it's 98 plus degrees outside. Let's go to the next slide. So Anita is a farmer from New Mexico, and she expressed to me how these expectations have influenced her. She says, I remember my first farming experience, the farm manager told us that we needed to be financially viable. I think there is a huge power dynamic when I am working for other people, and I'm always aware of that. I've had unfortunate experiences with working with pretty harsh landowners or farmers where there is definitely a power dynamic but class separation. So I'm definitely viewed as hired help and manual labor and kind of seen as less than. Next. So this is a pretty long quote, but I think it's really important. She's talking about her experience in a farm up in Pennsylvania, and she says the farm owner had us plant way more than she could ever sell. Her technique was just to plant the shit out of everything, so we had rows and rows of salad greens, and she was very strict that we couldn't use gloves. So this was during winter in Pennsylvania. So she had us harvesting with no gloves, headlamps, and then we would turn on the truck headlights so that we could see what we were harvesting. And when I tell you that it was cold, it was so cold that the night before I would just think about how cold I would be and would feel dread. We would be harvesting and you know when you're cold, it actually hurts. You couldn't move them. It was just this burning feeling in her hands. I think it was because we were all starting to get frostbite. We were afraid of her. She was terrifying. Working on that farm was probably some of the hardest things I had ever had to do in my life. So here we see that these expectations coming from the farm owner, specifically just to grow without a target audience, was causing physical challenges for Anita. And then she later goes on to tell me that other experiences cause trauma-induced arthritis. So we see this cycle here. Let's go to the next slide. So this is the last connection that I've made, and that's capitalism, privilege, racism, ableism, all those things make the world really expensive. It is absolutely expensive to live. And this disproportionately impacts BIPOC and disabled folks. Because we have limited socioeconomic resources. So if we have limited socioeconomic resources, we're not purchasing land and land that's accessible. We're not purchasing tools. We're not making improvements to make things more accessible. We're not accessing transportation. The cost of an accessible car can be the cost of a salary, as well as outdoor gear. Outdoor gear is extremely expensive, and we're not investing in nature-based education. Let's go to the next slide. So what this means is that people with disabilities live in poverty at more than twice the rate of people without. Almost 300,000 people with disabilities work for sub-minimum wage. And the median annual income for households receiving rent assistance is a little over $13,000. If you are struggling with how you're gonna live by the day, you're probably not thinking about how you're gonna spend your leisure time in a park. Let's go to the next slide. And this directly affects our, like I said, our experience with nature, because 2.4 million farm workers of color do not own or operate their own farms. Black and Indigenous farmers in particular have lower net cash incomes. And environmental studies is one of the least diverse fields in STEM. And then when it comes to Indigenous peoples, poverty is arguably the greatest obstacle to their efforts to improve accessibility in tribal built environments. Let's go to the next page. The next slide. So here's just a reality situation. When I say that accessible things are expensive, I'm not underestimating that. So you have on the top left a float that's designed for someone with a disability on sale for $185. Underneath that, you have a vest design, a floating vest designed for someone without a disability for $21.99. Top right, we have a mobility device that helps people move on the beach, on sand. That's literally on sale for over $2,000. Something as simple as binoculars. Sometimes people can't move their arms up, right? They can't hold on to the roundness of a binocular. And if you need a binocular with your limitation, that's going to cost you $300 versus binoculars that aren't designed for people's needs, which is about 90 bucks. So these are just a few of the many, many examples. And that's not even to say that people who need accessible gear usually can't find it because no one has designed it. So let's go to the next page, the next slide. So before we talk about what work needs to be done, if there's something that resonates with you, please add it to the chat. I see that someone talked about, I help to run a therapy garden space here in Toronto at the Center for Addictions and Mental Health on behalf of Food Share Toronto. One of the keys to our success that we push for is to make sure we are totally financially sustained and don't worry about having to be productive, or financially viable. So we relieve that stress for clients to more accessibly participate at whatever level they're able. That's extremely important. I think a lot of people who work on farms or who grow food are so worried about profits that pushes them to treating others a certain way, where everything is about harvesting and money. If anyone else wants to share maybe something they learned so far or another story, please do in the chat. And then we could go ahead and go to the next slide. So what work needs to be done? The same way we have to unpack things at the root, we have to get to the root of how we can help as well. And what you'll see is that the work that needs to be done in order to create justice within the disabled and the BIPOC communities. First is acknowledge your privilege. The majority of everything we know about growing food, medicine, and being in relationship with nature has been stolen by Indigenous peoples and has been repackaged. So how can you show gratitude and respect to those who are the original land stewards? How can you show gratitude and respect to the original herbalists and farmers? And then when it comes to navigating your privilege, really think about how to speak up on injustices in nature spaces that you're involved in. whether you're a volunteer or whether you own it? How can you hold others accountable? And how can you make space for others to be able to engage with nature? In what ways can you use your privilege to provide opportunities to the elderly who may have been deprived for a really long time, as well as the youth who are coming into society with all the BS that is going on now? Let's go to the next slide. And it also means that you also have to unlearn everything, right? So someone mentioned about alternatives to these definitions and models, and I think this is a really wonderful place to start. So the social model of disability says that people are disabled by barriers in society, such as buildings not having a ramp, and people's attitudes. So people assuming that disabled people can't do certain things. If we reframe what we think about disability and say, hey, this person doesn't have a disability, this community is fucked up, this community doesn't have these things to make this person thrive, then that changes everything, right? Because now the responsibility isn't on that disabled person to get better. The responsibility is on everybody else. It's on all of us. It's a community effort. I also really think we need to learn from Indigenous people's perspectives, right? And because there's not one specific type of Indigenous person. There are hundreds and thousands of different tribes and communities. But what we could do is we could research and learn and listen to these people and hear about what they have to say about disability, if that's even something in their language. Because sometimes from my research, there aren't certain words for the words that we have created. And figure out, well, how does everyone else see this? So here are some examples. So in Indian Sign Language, so there is no words for help or rehabilitation, but they can sign work together, and that deaf natives want partners, not saviors. The other thing is that Indigenous disability, in some people's views, is produced by colonialism, right? And that tribal communities have not other disability historically or traditionally. So we have a lot to learn from these communities. Let's go to the next slide. And listen and learn from others. That's why I started my project. I wanted to learn from people who are experiencing this hands-on. I have my own challenges, but I don't have every challenge. And I think to start is that we have to learn that there are different types of disabilities. A lot of people in the agriculture and nature space only think about disabilities in terms of wheelchairs. They say, hey, I have a raised bed, we're accessible, and that's not the case. There's different type of disabilities, developmental, psychiatric, visual, hearing. We could create spaces that facilitate participation for anyone who has a disability in any of those categories. Obviously learn about BIPOC experiences and show that you acknowledge your privilege by directly supporting them in the ways that they want to be supported. Let's go to the next slide. So this is a really great diagram that talks about how to involve people, and I think it's great for involving BIPOC and disabled people. And when we say involved, a lot of people think about maybe the number 1, inform. And inform means, providing the community with relevant information. But as we go along each numbers, we see that involving these people means having them completely involved in your community where you give them power to make decisions based on their experience. So at 4, delegated power, ensure community capacity to play a leadership role in implementation of decisions, right? Saying, hey, your leadership and expertise are critical to how we address this issue. Or 5, community ownership. I'm saying, hey, it's time to unlock collective power and capacity for transformative solutions. So we're giving you this budget, or we're giving you this power to make these decisions. So thinking about how you have tried to involve people before, figuring out what number that falls along and how you could bump it up to the next number. An example of this is saying, I run a community garden. I am going to invite people with disabilities or different experience, and I'm going to listen to their experiences and put aside a budget so that they can decide how to make the space more accessible. That's how you involve people. Let's go to the next slide. With that being said, I think it's important that we all spend time brainstorming how to make spaces safe and accessible. This example is regarding accessibility, but it also is an example you could use to make spaces safe for BIPOC folks. And this is an activity that you could take back to your team. And what this means is that when it comes to making an accessible space, preparation is key, right? Perhaps you yourself are in a predicament where you have a nature space and you didn't think about disabled people, and now it's not accessible, but you want to make something better. So preparation is key because you have to try to anticipate different people's lived experiences before they come into your nature space. So spend time brainstorming, right? What you can do is choose an activity that happens in nature space that is meaningful to you. So perhaps harvesting is meaningful to you. Ask yourself, what privileges am I afforded that allow myself to engage in this activity? Really do an activity analysis. So if it's harvesting, I have to stand up, I have to reach my arm, I have to pull the pepper or whatever from the plant, I have to put it in the basket, and I have to do that a bunch of times, right? I have to squat, I have to move things out the side. What physical, visual, hearing skills are you using to do that activity? Because the next step is consider what it would be like if you didn't have those skills. What would it be like to harvest peppers if you didn't have if you couldn't see, if you couldn't hear, if you couldn't squat, if you had back pain, right? If you had a prosthetic leg, what would that be like? Use your own problem-solving skills before you do your research and before you talk to disabled people, because accessibility is a long-term commitment, right? It's always going to change based on your community. So you need to strengthen how you're able to analyze the world around you. Let's go to the next slide. And then try to make nature-based experiences possible for everyone. So I really love that Anita has now, she has her own farm, and she was the person who described having those cold fingers working for that person in Pennsylvania. And when I asked her, is there a difference between how you use your body now versus how you used your body before? She told me that she's finally found the time to experience joy and have better boundaries with herself and on the land. Invest and support in whatever way possible to BIPOC and disabled farmers, herbalists, environmentalists, but also research and create a care web and mutual aid. I think this book on the corner called Care Work, Dreaming of Disability Justice is a fascinating book that can help you understand what it looks like to care for other people, especially people who are disabled. And I think that's important because regardless if we use the word disabled or impairments or challenges, we're all unique and we all have different struggles. So how can you create a care web or mutual aid within your communities so that you're all supporting each other? And another idea could be, if you know something is really expensive, like say like outdoor gear or tools or books, how can you pass along these tools to other people so that you're lifting off this financial barrier that so many of us have? Let's go to the next slide. Be a better employer if you are an employer. Be transparent with the job description and include what accommodations can be made. So on the bottom right side of this slide, I screenshotted I found 1 to 2 job descriptions out of probably 100 job descriptions that I looked at that actually included reasonable accommodations may be made to enable individuals with disabilities. Everyone should have this in their job description because accommodations are absolutely necessary and it's required by law. But also it just makes you a decent human being. You will be surprised about what you can do to transform a space with just a little bit of problem solving. Ensure that workers have their needs met, obviously, and then explore what a human-centered work culture looks like for you and your team. For me, every job should include ergonomic training. And ergonomic training means how to figure out how to move your body in the best way possible to prevent illness. So how can we harvest, pick up fruit, put things away, move equipment on the land so that we're not injuring ourselves. Creating opportunities for employees to express their concerns anonymously, addressing and solving issues collaboratively, and please make sure that any event listing you have is accessible. I will send out, if anyone likes it, a resource guide of different articles and websites and an article on making event listings accessible. That can be really helpful. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so improving your site's accessibility isn't an easy job. It can be easy, but for the most part, a lot of us have nature spaces where the foundation is accessible. I think everyone can make a nature space more accessible, but there's a lot of information out there. And if this is something you want to do, it's really important for you to consult with someone and to talk to disabled people. But the following things are things that we should all be aware of because we can at least call them out when we see them. The first is if people can't enter a space, they're not engaging with the space. Therefore, pathways should be your first priority. Pathways need to be smooth, right? They can't have gravel. They can't have wood chips. Think about people who shuffle their feet, who use a wheelchair, who use a walker, people who fall often. So make sure the materials are flat, they offer grip, and there's other differences like making sure that there's only subtle differences in coloration or texture, that they're wide, because a wheelchair user needs a certain amount of space. But we could take that a step further, right? So people want to socialize in nature spaces. So if you have a path that only fits one wheelchair user, right, then you're diminishing the amount of socialization that can happen. In an ideal world, a path that's 6 to 8 feet will allow 2 wheelchair users to be side by side, or a wheelchair user and someone who's able to walk next to them, which I think is really important. Let's go to the next slide. The next thing is the curbing and edging, which is something that we can all bring to people's attention or make improvements on. Curbs and edges should be 6 inches or higher, and then the plants along the curb and edge should not obstruct people's view of what's ahead, right? So if you look at the picture on the top right, you're able to stand in front of this large curb, but also look ahead and see exactly where the path is going. Because when we think about disabilities, we also have to remember people have cognitive impairments. They should know where they're going at all times, which is why signs are so important, right? So have signs in your location. What is the name of this area and where is it going? Same with tactile maps. So a visual map is great, but tactile maps allow people who use sensation with their hands or whatever other surface to figure out where they are and where they can go in that space. As well as symbols can be helpful, especially in gardens with children or people who understand symbols better. So having symbols instead of words can be helpful too. Let's go to the next slide. Consider alternatives, right? So a lot of farmers have a very specific way of how we're going to grow food, but that's not always accessible. And sometimes alternatives are great. So there's raised beds that we can invest in. And I'll talk a little bit about the shape of the raised bed on the next slide, but also using tactile cues, whether that is bombs like sticker bombs or a different surface at the end of raised beds can mark when the raised bed is ending. So people who aren't able to see can feel and see where the start and end of the raised bed is. Drip irrigation system means that we do not have to carry buckets of water to water our plants. We have a system in place. And then vertical gardening and aqua and hydroponics is really wonderful because one, bending is not required for a lot of them. You're able to get up close. So if you have a visual impairment or you aren't able to squat, and all the good smelling herbs and flowers are on the floor, you're not going to be able to interact with them. But if you could put them in a vertical place, right, now they're right in front of my face and I'm able to interact with them in whatever way I like. And then vertical and aqua and hydroponics allow for design flexibility, and they can be indoors. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so this is what I was saying, that you have to be using your, you have to think through these problems, because sometimes things will say that they're accessible and they're not the best accessible thing. So on the top left is a raised bed that I see all the time. It's just a high piece of material. And if you see the person who's in the wheelchair, they have to turn their body, right? Imagine how comfortable that is if every single time you're gardening, your body is turned. A lot of people in a wheelchair already have discomfort with how the wheelchair fits and how it feels. So if I have to turn my body to water and to harvest and to engage, it's not going to be a fun time. Versus the raised bed on the bottom, which has legs, you're able to go underneath the raised bed, right? And you're able to spread your arms forward. Now there's a better interaction with whatever you're growing. And there's different shapes for raised beds to allow socialization and just better movement. Let's go to the next slide. Adapted tools and equipment is awesome because it's not only helpful for people with disabilities, but it's helpful for everyone. So having long handles and ergonomic tools can save someone from experiencing strains and arthritis. Same with kneelers and stools, prevents back and knee pain. Let's go to the next. Okay, so the next few slides are just some terminology and how they could be applied to nature spaces so that you know what words to use when you're trying to make things more accessible. So an accommodation is when a person with a disability is not able to benefit from a product, device, or service or environment, so they ask for an accommodation. The thing about accommodations is that it can feel like a burden because the person has to disclose personal information. And it might be denied. So here's a cartoon where, the gardener is saying, all right, for the next 45 minutes, and then one of the participants is saying, sorry, but can I have a chair or can we go somewhere with shade? So having to disclose something that might be viewed as uncomfortable. Let's go to the next slide. Accessibility is when a product device is designed with the needs of people with disabilities in mind. So a space is not accessible if it wasn't designed with disabled people in mind or wasn't designed by disabled people. So this happens all the time. Somebody using a mobility device is in a nature space. And now they're, and now there are stairs, and it's kind of just like, shit, well, I guess I have to go back, or I guess I have to figure something else out. Next slide. Universal design is really wonderful because it's a process that follows specific principles when creating everything. And these principles allow people of all abilities to benefit from the design. So it's not specifically made for disabled people, it's just made for everyone. Here's an example. So this cartoon on the top right with the hat is kneeling on the grass while planting. And it says, this person is resting on their knees and they are tired from standing and kneeling often. They sometimes lose their balance when they're moving heavy things into a certain position. While the person on the left who's holding the watering can is gardening with a raised bed, and they're living their best life, right? We don't know if they have a disability or not. We just know that the way this space was designed helps everybody. So raised bed is a great example of universal design being used. Let's go to the next slide, which might be the end. Okay. So I think we're over time, but I just want to open the space for anybody who wants to share any information or ask questions. Please go ahead and do so in the chat or unmute yourself.
Yeah, and we have about, I would say we have at least 20 minutes to
great.
take questions and you know, share conversations. So don't be shy, everybody.
I see someone said, grateful for this space. I have another commitment, but hope to rewatch the rest later. And yes, it's recorded. Thank you so much. This has been really helpful. I'm really curious as to what motivated people to attend this webinar. Are you someone who owns a nature space? Are you someone who visits a nature space? If you could share that with me in the comments or unmute yourself.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, this is Toy. And I just wanted to say, first off, thank you so much for just sharing this with us and opening this conversation. It's one that I've had in little bubbles in different parts of, well, I live in Puerto Rico right now, but when I was in the States, you know, I worked at sustainable foods places, community gardens. I've done a lot of food justice work. And as a sick and disabled person, or a person that became more and more, I guess, is all I can say to, I don't know if people identify with that, but as I got older, became more and more sick and disabled. I just noticed how inaccessible all these spaces were. I wanted to work on farms and I couldn't, and people would be like, oh, well, you can do paperwork, or I don't really know, you know, they would react to me as if I was trying to, or like I was lazy. I didn't want to do the work. That's why I was saying I couldn't. So that was a problem. And then now in just trying to get land and continue doing the work that I do, more healing justice and food justice work here, there are a lot of barriers for us, and there's not really a template or like anything. So I've had to look into like adaptive gardening, I guess, and just things like that. And when I want to write a grant, I'm like, there aren't grants for that specific thing in the way that I want to do it with BIPOC, you know, that kind of thing. So I'm just really grateful to be in this space with y'all. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing. And I resonate a lot with that. There is no blueprint, which is why it was so difficult collecting all this different type of information for this presentation, because there's a little bit of research here and a little bit of resources there. And it takes a lot of work to put together an idea of like how to approach this. And something that I do, mainly because I have this occupational therapy background, is I try to engage in as many gardening or farming related activities as possible. And I really sit with myself and I think about my own challenges and the challenges of people I've encountered, and say, well, how can I do this if I didn't have this, right? How can I, what are some creative solutions to figuring out this problem? And I think if we all did that, it can become a blueprint. It could become a book, an article, a guide on like how to garden, how to this with a disability, with an impairment. And the reflection question I gave in the beginning, it's like, even if we are in the best shape of our lives in 10, 20, or 30 years from now, the way we engage with nature is going to be really different. So we really have to sit with ourselves and say, what is it that I love about nature? And what if that's not accessible to me anymore? So that we can all just have these conversations that are needed. But thank you for sharing, Toy. I have some questions in the chat. There was one that says, have you published your research or are planning to do so? I haven't published my research. I have just started putting my services out there as like a consultant, someone who could help you walk through accessibility, as well as creating safe spaces. I would like to publish something eventually. I also put up articles once in a while on my blog, but right now I'm kind of just like waiting to have more conversations with other people to figure out the best way to share all this. There's another comment that says, have you seen or heard about a production farm which has been designed effectively with disability justice in mind? No, I have not heard or seen a farm like that. I would love to see a farm like that. If anyone on this call has made any done anything like that, please share with us. But no, I haven't. I'm grateful for this presentations. I'm in the process of starting an urban forest farm. I'm trying to figure out how to make the space as accessible as possible. I've come to realize that although I'm a queer Black woman, I still have a lot of privilege. Thank you for creating this space. Yeah. I'm a CODA. So a CODA is a certified occupational therapy assistant, and work with kids in my community and have a personal passion for the healing nature of putting my hands in the soil. I was interested in expanding my knowledge and possibly learning things I can advocate for in my community and professionally. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, that's awesome. Something I didn't talk about in this slide was if you are a nature space that is trying to figure out how to financially make accessibility possible, I highly suggest that you should reach out to occupational therapy programs at the universities, because they usually have funding and they usually take on projects for students to learn. So if you could collaborate with a university that has an occupational therapy program, you might be able to have a bunch of professionals in training come and make some changes on your farm or whatever space you have. Any other comments or feedback that anyone would like to share? What did you study in college? In undergrad, I studied psychology, and for my master's degree, I studied occupational therapy. And then Toy said, I've seen camps or farms or green spaces for folks with autism spectrum and an adoptive farm in Spain that our collective reached out to a couple years back. Yeah, that's really cool. I noticed that in a lot of the research, there's a huge emphasis on making nature spaces, specifically like play spaces, more accessible for children with disabilities. But yeah, if you could share what the farm was, the adaptive farm, that would be really cool. And okay. And then my family runs a therapeutic farm, and now they're doing urban farming. I would love to connect. Yeah, definitely. If anybody would like to connect or would like me to talk through how their space can be more accessible and inclusive, whether it's to be a safe space for BIPOC individuals or for people with disabilities, please just reach out to the email I have listed here, or hit me up on my website or on Instagram. But I think we're good.
And I just want to thank you once again, Christy. You know, again, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and unmute yourself. This is a bit of a last call, but Christy, thank you so much for sharing this space with us, for coming and educating us all today. This was a beautiful, thoughtful, and wonderful presentation, and I personally learned so much. So again, I just appreciate you being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for being here and, you know, learning. And I really hope that other people continue to have this conversation, and please keep me in the loop. I'm so passionate about this and I would love to see what everybody else is doing with this information.
And I will shortly be sending an email with the follow-up link and all the links to the things I mentioned in the beginning, and then also Christy's email and the link to Christy's Instagram. Thank you all so much for attending. We hope you have a good week.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you again, Christy. I think I'm going to close out the call.
Sure, yeah. I was just reading all the comments, making sure I didn't miss anything, but I think I'm good.
Awesome. I think you got them all. Thank you so much. And hope everyone has a good week.
Same. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.